Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be somewhat of a departure from the usual videos about programming. This is about an interest of mine, philosophy. So fair warning, if you want to leave, go ahead and do so now. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking about ontological voids. Before I start talking about ontological voids, and you're going to get sick of hearing me say the word ontological, we're going to talk about bubbles. Bubbles hold clues on how we classify things. They can shift over time, and they also vary between people. So what I classify as a child, you might not, but they're probably going to be largely the same. So for example, I view children as needy, pretty ignorant. I'm not saying that in like a bad way, but they don't have as much life experience. Innocent, small, young. Young kind of implies being small, so that's why there's a bit of overlap there. And also usually human, but they don't have to be human. You can be a child of a chimpanzee or an elephant, and people still refer to them as children, but not typically. So moving on, there's some things which have a lot of overlap, but just the presence of one different attribute or two can make them different things. So for example, stools and chairs, they have things in common. They both have legs, although different amounts. They have a seat, and they're typically made out of metal or wood. However, if we see a structure that has a seat, is made out of metal or wood, has legs, but also has a back, our mind classifies it as a chair. And it's something automatic. We don't really have to sit there. We don't sit there with a checklist and check off, oh, it's got legs, it's got a seat, it's made out of wood. It's an automatic process. And we automatically think it's a chair if it really matches up with our ontological bubble of a chair, or we pretty quickly evaluate it to be a stool if it has 3 legs and no back, or 4 legs and no back. We classify it as a stool. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, as our ancestors would have to quickly identify if something is a threat or not, or what it is, what kind of predator it might be. That way we can make decisions as quickly as possible on whether to retreat or attack or whatever. So a greater part of the bubbles is the ontological map. This is a collection. Everyone has their own map, and this is based on your learned and lived experience. So, for example, I have my own idea of what a tree is. I have my own idea of what a person is. I have my own idea of what the color red looks like, which you might, depending on your brain, we can never really know what other people perceive as red. For what might look like red to me might not look like red to you, but that's a whole other topic. I have my idea of what something small is, and this makes sense. A person who's 6'6" and weighs, 250 pounds, probably has a different idea of what small is compared to someone who's 4'8" and weighs 120 pounds. The smaller person, of course, might see themselves as regular, while the larger person sees the smaller person as small. And most of all, which kind of goes to show how amorphous these bubbles can be, is what we consider attractive. There's a huge range of what people consider attractive in other people, and it's largely, I don't know for sure, but probably largely based on maybe, I'm just taking some guesses here, genetics, culture, maybe even how you're raised. Probably a combination of all of those things, right? But there's an incredible, people don't even try to agree on this thing because it's extremely subjective. I mean, some people might agree on it, and there's probably some consensus to be found, but to a large extent, deciding what's attractive or not attractive and finding consensus among that is pretty futile because it varies so much. So another thing is, things can shift bubbles as time goes on. So, for example, people usually, and of course this is not a hard and fast rule, but we start off as children, and the reason why is because we display the attributes that children typically display. I covered some of those earlier. Then we sort of get a little more experienced, a little more angsty, more dependent, and more craving of independence. And we kind of shift into this teen bubble. Then all that angst kind of leaves us, and as we start getting the ability to support ourselves, we kind of move into this adult role. Finally, some of that independence is taken from us, and we start to get slower as we age, and we kind of move into the senior role and, start to retire from our jobs and stuff. But so not only are bubbles amorphous, but things can also kind of move from bubble to bubble. In this case, the bubble is staying the same, but we're the ones that are moving from bubble to bubble. Even though we're technically the same being, we're still the same person. I'm still the same artist, but I'm essentially changing who I am, and not necessarily by choice, but through a natural biological process. Now here's where we kind of start talking about voids. So something teenager and young adult are both relatively recent inventions, and they were kind of made out of necessity because the transition from child to teen was seen as too abrupt, and teen to adult was also seen as too abrupt. Meaning there are large spans of time, or relatively large anyway, where people were between a child and a teen, but they weren't quite teens at the time. Maybe they were starting to get kind of angsty, not as innocent as a child, so we came up with teenager. Thus, a void was filled, and the term was coined. Same thing for young adult. Teens don't wake up one day and really display a lot of the qualities of an adult, but they start to get more responsible, but maybe they're still partying, they're still doing things that are a little irresponsible, they still can act a little irrationally, and I think that's why the term young adult is kind of popular nowadays. So the past is kind of interesting. Before things like the Industrial Revolution, where children kind of have more freedom to not work and to take more time to learn and develop, teenagers didn't really exist. You're a child, and then as soon as you kind of hit puberty, you were kind of saddled with the responsibilities of an adult. You can see a lot of this. One example that pops in my head is England. Right around the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of rights that mandated children to go to school until a certain age. And you really didn't have this teenager phase. There was no time to kind of learn about yourself or develop your own identity. You were kind of forced to work if you didn't want to starve. And there was really no need for the term teenager. So as time goes on, though, you can see in this chart over here, around the 1950s, the term teenager started to kind of become more popular as the world conditions transitioned, such that conditions were right for somebody that exhibited the qualities of a teenager to exist. So an ontological void, in other words, was created because the conditions of the world changed. And thus, the ontological void creates a sort of a vacuum and gave birth to the term teenager, and then later even tweenager, as we discussed. There's also a lot of ad hoc bubbles. I won't spend too much time on this. These are kind of like, they fill temporary ontological voids, but they're not permanent. These are ontological voids which pop up from day to day, but not common enough that we need a whole new word for them, but we can just attach an adjective and be satisfied. So if we see a chair that has a back, but perhaps the back has been snapped in half, then we can say, oh, that's a broken chair. Maybe if there's a princess, but the princess is ugly, we don't need a whole new word for a princess that is ugly. We can just say, oh, that's an ugly princess. Kind of a rude example, I apologize. Or if we see a chair that is smaller than our typical idea of a chair, we can just say that's a tiny chair. We don't need to make a new word for a tiny chair unless tiny chairs become so common that tiny chair is now like a stable concept in the minds of society. So another ontological void is typically, I looked this up, so if you Google town, it's defined as an urban area that has a name, defined boundaries, local government, etc. And a village is a group of houses and associated buildings larger than a hamlet and smaller than a town, situated in a rural area. It's kind of interesting. There's not much in between here. You go from a village into a town, and there is kind of a space in between where a community is bigger than a village, smaller than a town, but we don't really have a word for that. Of course, you could argue that, yeah, village and town are close enough to where things can smoothly kind of transition, but there always will be a void, maybe a small one, between the two, where things are in between. And if this void is big enough, it creates this discomfort that needs to be filled. So an example for me that I always kind of thought about was the village, although I hesitate to call it village, where I was born, called Shiroka. Now, as you can see, it's got a lot of houses, a lot more than this village here, but I don't want to call it a town, and I don't want to call it a village, because village just seems kind of too small to describe the community. But it doesn't feel like a town either, mainly because the houses are disorganized, and there's no central government for it. The central government is derived from the city nearby. So this is like almost like a personal ontological void. I really want to call it something like a burg, like B-U-R-G. But of course that has its own meaning, although words can change. So this is kind of a personal ontological void that makes me a little uncomfortable, and I really wish there was a better word to describe it, because I don't think village or town really do it justice. So when we have ontological voids, they occur most often when something new is created and no word exists for it yet, or something existing has morphed beyond its bubble. So it kind of demands a new word to describe it. This is similar to something new being created, except it's not completely new. It's kind of an evolution of something existing. So I have 4 examples here. Games have been around for thousands of years, but suddenly we had games which use some sort of electronic display, such as like a TV monitor or whatever it might have been. And all of a sudden, these were games, but game just didn't cut it anymore. It was sort of like revolution. It had a lot in common with games, but there was also something essentially different about it. And I believe this gave gave rise to the term video game. It is a game, but it's not just a game. It's a video game. It's something much more incredible and interesting and flexible as well. Same thing with car. Well, not the same thing, but we had carriages. A car just kind of put an engine in it and made the wheels move with the engine, and thus we have car. So it's not completely new. I mean, the earliest cars, they look very similar to carriages, but a horse wasn't pulling it. It was an engine. So we have machine guns. Machine gun is an interesting one because it's essentially a gun. It just shoots really fast. And even the word machine gun feels like really redundant. As far as I know, all guns are machines. So machine gun doesn't make much sense. But again, it goes to show that there's something essentially different about machine guns, mainly how much more extremely lethal they were, that public consciousness kind of decided that it needs a different name. because gun isn't cutting it. Gun doesn't really give you a sense of the lethality that a machine gun represented. Finally, we have supercomputer, which is another interesting one, because to each previous generation, every computer is a supercomputer. So essentially, it's just a fast computer, right? And it's a supercomputer. So again, computer doesn't cut it, but public consciousness, they kind of decided, or marketing or whatever, that a new term was needed to describe the supercomputers of each generation. A computer that was so much more powerful than the average household computer, we have to call it something different. Something interesting, and I think this is going to be one of the most controversial parts of the video, which I'm okay with it, is I think there's a big ontological void between living and non-living. So on living, we have things that most people agree on. I'm living, cows are living. Okay, that's fine. And then we have non-living things, such as bookshelves. I don't think anyone would disagree that a bookshelf is not living. And then we get to this kind of gray zone. Specifically, viruses. They display a lot of qualities of living things, but not all of them. And I actually want to put computers in the same category, especially modern computers. And when I mean computers, I don't mean just computers, but also like artificial intelligence software, where they display the ability to adapt, to react, to evolve. And personally, I almost see them on the same level as like bacteria. Because in my mind, bacteria are they're very close to viruses. They're essentially just biological machines. Only difference is that bacteria have cells and viruses don't. And for some reason, we attribute cells as some, to me, arbitrary landmark of something living. And I don't really see the big deal about it. Okay, it has a cell, so what? Anyway, plants are also something that I feel are almost like barely living. And again, I know, controversial, right? Everyone knows plants are living. But if you really think about it, I mean, people don't really behave towards plants as they behave towards like a cow or a cat, right? I feel kind of bad when I eat beef because I know a cow had to die for it. Very few people really think twice about biting into a pineapple or chopping down a tree for their new table. Like, yeah, you might feel slightly bad, but it's not really because you feel bad about the tree so much as you think, oh, this is probably not great for the environment. Like, I felt worse about killing characters in a computer game than I have about, chopping down a tree. Not that I really chop down trees, but like eating like a strawberry or, like something to that effect. So I think there's kind of like a need, like a new term for computers and viruses, especially as artificial intelligence develops, and it gets harder and harder to distinguish, is this computer living or is it non-living? Something like quasi-living, though I don't like that term, but there is definitely a void, for me at least, in that space. Just for completion's sake, this is a list of living characteristics. You can peruse at your own leisure. Homeostasis, I mean, computers, they have GPUs, they cool themselves down. Organization, this one, they're composed of cells. Again, I feel like this is extremely arbitrary. Metabolism, electricity, sure, growth. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting, and thanks for watching.